Let go? That's cute.
Let go.
Get away from her. This is a family matter. Stay out of it, kid. Are you hurt?
The slap of Larry's palm around her wrist cracked louder than it should have in a room this quiet. Agatha didn't scream. She had learned, over 20 years, that screaming only made him tighten his grip. "Let go," she whispered, and he laughed instead, low and mean, the kind of laugh that told her this was going to be one of those nights. Then the private dining room door opened, and the temperature in the room changed before anyone said a word. Kang Min-jae stood in the doorway in a black suit, and for 3 full seconds, nobody moved. He looked at Larry's hand, then at Agatha's face. Something in his jaw shifted. "Get away from her." Larry scoffed, waved a hand like he was swatting a fly. "This is a family matter. Stay out of it, kid." He shoved Agatha sideways to make his point, and that was the last mistake he made that night. Min-jae crossed the room in 2 strides and put him on the table with a single punch. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Because everyone in that room, every waiter, every guest, every bodyguard lining the wall, knew exactly whose fist that was. Nobody in Seoul crossed Kang Min-jae. Nobody breathed wrong around him. And yet here he was, standing over a groaning American businessman, not even looking at him anymore. He turned to Agatha, not to Larry. Never again to Larry. "Are you hurt?" Cut to black. Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe, because this one is going to wreck you in the best way. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. I want to know who's writing this story with me. 3 weeks before that punch landed, Agatha Artis stood in front of her bedroom mirror for exactly 4 seconds before turning away. 4 seconds was as long as she could stand looking at herself lately. 47 years old, and somewhere in the last decade she had stopped being a woman and started being a problem to be managed. Too loud when she laughed, too much when she dressed up, too old when she asked for anything at all. Larry was already in the doorway, tying his tie, not even glancing at the dress she'd chosen for dinner. "You're wearing that?" he said. Not a question, really. More of a verdict. "I liked it. Agatha, you're 47. It's a young woman's dress." He said it the way he said everything lately. Flat, bored, like he was correcting a spreadsheet error. She changed. She always changed. 22 years of marriage had taught her that peace was cheaper than pride. At dinner that night, Larry spent 40 minutes with his eyes on the waitress, a girl who couldn't have been older than 26, laughing at jokes he hadn't laughed at with Agatha in years. Agatha picked at her food and said nothing, because saying something meant a fight, and a fight meant 3 days of silence, and 3 days of silence in that enormous, echoing house was worse than anything he could say to her face. Later, in bed, staring at the ceiling, she made the mistake of asking the question that had been sitting in her chest for months. "Do you still find me attractive?" Larry didn't look up from his phone. "Why are you suddenly so insecure?" That single sentence did more damage than a slap would have. A slap heals. That sentence sat in her ribs like a stone she carried into every room for the next 3 weeks. Into the airport, into first class, into the glittering lobby of a 5-star Seoul hotel, where she had been sent to close the biggest partnership deal of her career, an American luxury fashion house finally breaking into the Korean market, and Agatha, the woman nobody complimented anymore, was the one who'd built the entire deal from scratch. Larry was supposed to fly with her. 3 hours before boarding, he canceled. "Something came up at the office," he said, not even bothering to make it sound believable. So she walked into the biggest night of her career alone, in a black dress she'd almost left at home, because Larry once said, black made her look severe. A younger woman in 6-inch heels barreled past her near the champagne table, elbow catching Agatha's wrist, just enough to send an entire glass of red wine down the front of that dress. The room turned to look. Agatha felt every set of eyes on her like heat. She didn't wait for an apology. She slipped through the nearest door and found herself on a private balcony, overlooking the glittering skyline of Gangnam. Mortified, dabbing uselessly at wine-soaked silk, blinking back tears she refused to let fall in public. You're standing in the one spot with decent lighting, a voice said behind her. If you're trying to hide, you've picked the worst possible place. She turned. A young man stood a few feet away, black suit, unreadable calm. The kind of stillness that made you feel like you were the one being too loud just by existing. He couldn't have been older than 25. For half a second, she assumed he worked the event, until she registered the cut of his suit, the way 3 older men near the door straightened the moment he'd stepped outside, the way nobody, absolutely nobody, followed him out here to check on him. I'm not hiding, she lied. I'm airing out a wine stain. He almost smiled. Almost. My mistake. I thought you were staff. And now? Now I can see the dress cost more than my car. A pause. I'm sorry. That was a strange thing to say to a stranger. She laughed before she could stop herself. A real laugh. The kind she hadn't heard out of her own mouth in longer than she wanted to admit. They talked. Easily, the way you talk to someone who has no idea what you're supposed to be, no history to hold against you. He asked what brought her to Seoul. She told him about the partnership, and he listened. Actually listened. The way people used to listen to her before she became furniture in her own marriage. Then he said something that stopped her cold. Your husband is a very lucky man. Argatha went still. Why would you say that? He looked at her, and there wasn't a trace of flattery in it, just something quiet and certain. Because he gets to come home to you. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Argatha Ardis had absolutely no idea what to say to a man. She never got his name that night. She didn't need to. 3 days later, in a boardroom full of Seoul's most powerful investors, she'd learn exactly who Kang Min-jae was, and exactly how far over her head she'd just stepped. If you're enjoying the story, hit subscribe. I've got a lot more coming, and you don't want to miss part 2. Let me know in the comments if you already sense where this is headed, because trust me, it gets so much messier before it gets better. Argatha found out exactly who he was 2 days later, and it nearly stopped her heart. She was sitting across the boardroom table from a row of Korean investors, when the door opened, and Kang Min-jae walked in, flanked by 2 men who moved like shadows attached to his heels. The entire room stood, not out of politeness, out of instinct. The head investor, a man in his 60s who hadn't so much as blinked at Argatha's proposal, practically bowed. Argatha's translator leaned toward her and whispered 4 words that changed everything. He controls this district. Not owns a company in this district, controls it. Argatha kept her expression professional through sheer force of will, while her mind scrambled to fit the gentle, listening young man from the balcony into the same body as the name people whispered like a warning. Kang Min-jae wasn't just wealthy. He was one of the most feared figures in Seoul's underworld, 25 years old and already untouchable. A man whose name made grown businessmen adjust their ties. He looked at her from across the table like they hadn't just spent 40 minutes laughing on a balcony 3 nights ago. Professional, composed. And then, right as the meeting ended, he caught her eye for exactly 1 second, and something in that look told her the balcony hadn't been forgotten at all. The partnership moved forward, which meant Argatha and Min-jae's paths kept crossing. Dinners, site visits, a whirlwind of translators and contracts. And every single time, he was there, and every single time, he made her feel like the smartest, most interesting person in the room, which was a feeling she hadn't experienced from a man in over a decade. He noticed things, small things, that she took her coffee black but only after 10 in the morning, that she touched her earring when she was nervous about being wrong in a meeting, that she flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever her phone buzzed with Larry's name on the screen. One evening, walking her back through the hotel lobby after a dinner neither of them wanted to end, he told her something that cracked straight through the careful composure she'd spent the whole trip maintaining. You shouldn't need permission to feel beautiful, he said. Argatha stopped walking. Men your age don't look at women like me, she said, and hated how small her voice sounded saying it out loud. Min-jae turned to face her fully. Maybe you've just been looking at the wrong men. She went back to her hotel room that night and cried for the first time in months, not out of sadness, but out of something more disorienting, the strange grief of realizing exactly how starved she'd been for a man's genuine attention, and exactly how long she'd convinced herself she didn't deserve it. But wait, here's where it gets messy, because Argatha Ardis was about to make the kind of decision that makes an entire comment section scream at their screen. Flowers arrived at her hotel room 2 mornings later. No card, but she knew. She sent them back down to the front desk without opening them. He asked her to dinner, just the two of them. No business pretense at all. She said no. I don't think you're happy, he told her plainly, the next time they crossed paths in the hotel restaurant. Something in her snapped defensive. You don't know anything about my marriage. He didn't argue. He simply nodded once and let her walk away, which somehow felt worse than if he'd fought for her right there. That night Larry called, demanding she come back to their New York house early, because he had a client dinner he needed her to attend, and smile through. Argatha packed her bag within the hour, canceling the rest of her soul trip, telling herself this was loyalty, telling herself 22 years meant something, telling herself a good wife doesn't run toward a 25-year-old stranger just because he makes her feel seen. If you're screaming at your screen right now, comment part 2 below because trust me, you are not alone, and this story is far from over. Argatha flew home. She sat beside Larry at that client dinner, smiling on command, refilling his water glass, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, and somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, a small, quiet part of her had already started to die. She didn't know it yet, but Min-jae wasn't finished, and neither was Larry, because Larry was about to find out exactly who his wife had been talking to in Seoul, and the way he reacted would reveal exactly what kind of man Argatha had spent 22 years married to. If you're liking this so far, hit that subscribe button. The twist coming up is one you will not see coming. Larry noticed the change before Argatha even realized there was one to notice. She was humming in the kitchen again, something she hadn't done in years. She'd started buying clothes she actually liked instead of the safe, shapeless things Larry approved of without comment. She laughed at her own jokes now, out loud, alone, and didn't apologize for it. Larry assumed the obvious. He assumed she was cheating. He started checking her phone while she showered. He asked, too casually, who she'd been texting in Seoul, and when she said it was just the partnership team, he stared at her a beat too long, like he was deciding whether to believe her. He accused her, out of nowhere, of embarrassing him in front of his colleagues by dressing, in his words, inappropriately for a woman her age. Then he saw a photo, a grainy shot from a Seoul business gala, forwarded by a colleague who thought it was funny. Argatha, laughing beside a strikingly young, sharply dressed Korean man at a cocktail table. Larry zoomed in, and Larry recognized the face. He went pale. Because Larry, unlike Argatha, moved in circles that touched international finance, circles where certain names got mentioned in hushed tones over expensive scotch. And the name Kang Min-jae was one of them, not as a businessman, but as something far more dangerous. A 25-year-old who had inherited a criminal empire and expanded it past anything his predecessors had built. A man responsible, according to whispered rumor, for things Larry didn't want sitting anywhere near his wife. That night, Larry's fear disguised itself as concern. "Stay away from him," he told her, gripping his glass so tight his knuckles went white. "Why?" Argatha asked, genuinely confused. Because in her mind, Min-jae was the gentlest man she'd met in years. "Because men like him don't love women like you," Larry said. That sentence lodged itself somewhere deep and ugly in Argatha's chest, and it stayed there for days, whispering to her every time she caught herself smiling at the memory of a Seoul balcony. But wait, here's where Larry shows you exactly who he really is, because 2 weeks later, at a family dinner with Larry's siblings and their spouses, he did something Argatha never saw coming. Over dessert, glass of wine in hand, Larry laughed and announced to the entire table that his wife had apparently caught the eye of some 25-year-old boy in Seoul. He said it like a punchline. He said Argatha had been dressing differently lately, clearly starved for attention, clearly delusional enough to think a man that young could possibly want her. "Maybe our wife thinks a 25-year-old Korean boy actually wants her," he said, and the table laughed. Argatha sat there, 47 years old, in front of people who were supposed to be her family, and felt something inside her crack straight down the middle. Every humiliation of the last 5 years compressed into that single moment at that table. And then, this is the part that will make you want to throw something at your screen. Instead of standing up and walking out, Argatha defended him. "He's my husband," she said quietly, staring at her plate. "If you're furious right now, trust me, I understand, and just wait, because it gets so much worse before it gets better." Across the room, at a private table Larry's siblings hadn't even noticed, Kang Min-jae had been seated for a business dinner of his own, close enough to hear every word. Argatha didn't see him until she looked up, and when she did, his expression wasn't jealousy, it wasn't anger. It was something far quieter and far more devastating. Disappointment. The specific disappointment of watching someone defend the very thing that was killing them. Later that night, in the hallway outside the private event space, Min-jae found her alone. "I can't keep watching you let him hurt you," he said, his voice low, controlled, but cracking at the edges in a way she'd never heard from him before. Argatha, defensive and exhausted and ashamed, told him to stay out of her marriage. "You're right," he said simply. Then he turned and walked away. And for the first time since that balcony, 3 weeks earlier, Argatha understood, with sudden and terrifying clarity, that she might actually lose him. But instead of running after him, instead of doing the one thing every person watching this video is screaming at her to do, Argatha turned around and went back to Larry. That night, lying in the dark beside a man who had just humiliated her in front of his entire family, Larry rolled over and delivered one final blow. "See?" he said. "Even he doesn't want you anymore." And God help her, Argatha believed him. If you're already yelling part 2 in the comments, hang on, because the private dinner is coming next, and it changes absolutely everything. Comment below where you're watching from if you haven't already, and hit that subscribe button now, because what happens next is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Larry called it a peace offering, a private dinner, just the two of them, at the same hotel where all of this had started. He told Argatha he wanted to fix things. He told her he'd been thinking, that maybe he'd been harder on her than she deserved, that maybe 22 years meant they owed each other one honest conversation before either of them did anything they couldn't take back. For one small, foolish, hopeful moment, Argatha believed him. She wore the black dress, she let herself hope, and for the first 20 minutes, Larry was almost the man she'd married, attentive, warm, asking about her flight, pouring her wine before she asked. Argatha felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in weeks. Then, over the appetizers, his voice shifted. He started small, a comment about how desperate she must have looked, laughing on some balcony with a man half her age. A comment about how Min-jae was probably only interested because she was easy, soft, lonely, manageable, exactly the kind of woman men like that knew how to use. He said it all with a smile, like he was doing her a favor by finally being honest. Argatha felt the old, familiar instinct rising in her. The instinct to shrink, to apologize, to smooth it over. And then, for the first time in 22 years, she didn't. "That's enough," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "I'm done sitting here and letting you tell me who I am." Larry's face changed instantly. The warmth evaporated. He reached across the table and grabbed her wrist, hard, the way he used to grip things when he was losing control of a negotiation. "Let go," Argatha said. He tightened his grip instead, leaning in close, his voice dropping into something colder than she'd ever heard from him. "You don't get to talk to me like that." That's when the door opened. Kang Min-jae stood in the doorway in a black suit, and for 3 full seconds, nobody in that private dining room moved. His eyes went straight to Larry's hand wrapped around Argatha's wrist. Something in his jaw shifted, and the temperature of the room changed before he said a single word. "Get away from her." Larry actually laughed, waving a hand like he was swatting away something small and irrelevant. "This is a family matter." "Stay out of it, kid." Min-jae took one step closer. Larry, panicking now, shoved Argatha sideways to make his point, and that was the last mistake he made that night. Min-jae crossed the room in 2 strides and put him on the table with a single punch. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight to it. Every waiter, every guest, every one of Min-jae's men lining the wall, understood exactly what they'd just watched, because nobody put their hands on Kang Min-jae and walked away clean, and yet here he was, standing over a groaning American businessman, already not looking at him anymore. He turned to Argatha. "Are you hurt?" She started crying, not from the shock of the punch, not from fear, but from something far more overwhelming. Someone had finally, after 22 years, cared enough to ask. "If you caught that, yes, this is where we came in. Now you know what happens after. And it only gets crazier from here. So if you haven't already, hit subscribe. Because this next part is the twist nobody saw coming. The punch cracked something open that had been sealed for years. Hotel security got involved. Larry, humiliated and furious, threatened to press charges, right up until Min Jae's lawyer calmly mentioned that hotel security cameras had captured the entire altercation, including the moment Larry grabbed his wife's wrist hard enough to leave a mark. Larry went quiet very fast, but that wasn't the twist. Here's the twist. 2 days later, while reviewing the emergency financial documents her lawyer requested for the incident report, Argatha discovered something Larry had been hiding for months. He'd been quietly transferring money out of their joint accounts into a private account she'd never known existed. He'd met with a divorce attorney 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks. Before any of this. Before Seoul. Before the wine spilled on a balcony. Before any of it. He had already been planning to leave her, to strip the marriage for parts, to walk away with as much as he could take and leave her with nothing but the house and the humiliation. The man who spent years telling her nobody else would ever want her had already been planning his own exit, quietly, coldly, for months. It wasn't about losing Argatha. It had never been about losing Argatha. It was about controlling the terms on which he lost her. Min Jae didn't say "I told you so." He didn't even bring it up. When Argatha, shaking, showed him the documents her lawyer had sent over, he simply looked at her and said the only thing that mattered. Choose yourself first, not him, herself. That single sentence would end up rewriting the rest of Argatha Ardis's life. If you're not already subscribed, now's the time, because Argatha's transformation, and the ending that made thousands of people beg for a part 2, is coming up right now. Argatha confronted Larry 3 days later, in the house they'd built together, surrounded by 22 years of furniture chosen to please him, and photographs of a marriage that had quietly been a performance for longer than she wanted to admit. She didn't cry. That surprised her more than anything else. She had spent months imagining this exact conversation ending in tears, in begging, in some desperate attempt to hold together something that had already crumbled from the inside. Instead, she stood in the kitchen, where she'd learned to make herself smaller, and she felt nothing but a strange, steady calm. "You spent years convincing me nobody would want me," she said, setting the folder of financial documents on the counter between them. "You were wrong." Larry tried anger first. He tried accusing her of being the one who ruined things, of embarrassing him, of throwing away 2 decades over some fling with a criminal half her age. When that didn't work, he tried something softer, something closer to pleading, reminding her of the house, the years, the life they'd built, asking her what she thought she was going to do at 47, starting over, alone. Argatha almost laughed at that. Alone. As if the last 5 years hadn't already been the loneliest of her life, just with someone sitting across the table from her while it happened. "I'd rather be alone and whole than married and disappearing," she told him, and walked out of that kitchen for the last time. But wait, because here's where a lot of people expected this story to end, and it doesn't. Not even close. Argatha didn't run to Min Jae. That's the part that surprised even her. As much as some quiet corner of her heart wanted to fly straight back to Seoul and fall into his arms, she understood something for the first time in her adult life. That she needed to know who Argatha Ardis was without a man defining the shape of her, without Larry's criticism, or Min Jae's admiration deciding whether she got to feel beautiful on a given day. So she gave herself the divorce. She gave herself the lawyer, the paperwork, the long, exhausting process of untangling 22 years of shared finances and shared friends who had to pick a side. She moved into a smaller apartment that was entirely, completely hers, and she cried on the floor of it more than once, and she got back up more times than she cried. She went back to work full-time, throwing herself into the very partnership that had first taken her to Seoul, and discovered she was even better at her job than she'd let herself believe when she was busy managing Larry's moods around the edges of her career. She reconnected with 2 college friends she'd let drift away during the marriage, women who remembered exactly who she used to be before she started shrinking herself. She started buying the dresses she liked, not for anyone, for herself. Slowly, in the mirror, the 4 seconds became 5, became 10, became long enough to actually see the woman standing there instead of flinching away from her. And through all of it, Min Jae gave her space. He didn't call constantly. He didn't show up outside her new apartment with grand gestures. Once, he sent a single message, 3 months after the divorce was finalized. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere. If you're wondering whether this is the part where he disappears forever, don't worry. This is the part where everything comes together, and it's exactly the ending you've been waiting for. If you haven't hit subscribe yet, now's the moment, because what happens next is the reason thousands of people are already begging in the comments for a part 2. 7 months after that punch landed in a private Seoul dining room, Agatha flew back to Korea. Not for business this time. Not for Larry. Not for anyone but herself. She had a new position overseeing the entire Asia-Pacific expansion of the fashion house. A promotion she'd earned entirely on her own, after the divorce forced her to fight for a seat at the table she used to let Larry's presence overshadow. She stepped out of the same hotel where all of this had started, into the same glittering Gangnam evening light, and there he was. Kang Min-jae stood near the entrance in a black suit, hands in his pockets, exactly as still and exactly as composed as the first night she'd mistaken him for hotel staff. He looked up, he saw her, and for the first time since she'd known him, Agatha watched something crack open in that careful, controlled expression. Something unguarded, something almost boyish, something that looked a great deal like relief. She walked toward him slowly, feeling 7 months of rebuilding herself settle into her spine with every step. "You look happy," he said. "I am," she said, and meant it completely, for what felt like the first time in years. "Are you still afraid of me?" he asked, something teasing under the seriousness of the question. Agatha smiled. "No." She reached out and took his hand, not out of desperation, not out of loneliness, not because she needed rescuing, but because she wanted to, which was an entirely different thing than anything she'd felt in her marriage in over a decade. "I thought you couldn't possibly want a woman like me," she admitted quietly, the old fear surfacing one last time before she let it go completely. Min-jae looked at her, and there was nothing performative in his expression, nothing calculated, just the same quiet certainty that had first knocked the breath out of her on a wine-stained balcony 7 months earlier. "Agatha," he said, "I never wanted a woman like you." Her stomach dropped, confusion flickering across her face for half a second before he finished. "I wanted you." She kissed him then, right there outside the hotel where a stranger had once told her she was standing in the one spot with decent lighting. And this time there was no wine stain to hide, no husband waiting somewhere inside to make her feel small, nothing standing between the 47-year-old woman she'd finally learned to see and the man who had seen her clearly since the very first night. Not because a 25-year-old mafia boss had rescued her, because after 22 years of being made to feel invisible, he had been the first person to look at her and make her feel completely, undeniably seen. But this isn't over. Because Larry isn't done, and there's something Agatha doesn't know yet about exactly how far he's willing to go to make sure this story doesn't end the way it just did. If you want to know what happens next, comment part 2 right now, and make sure you're subscribed, because this is only the beginning of what Larry has planned. Let me know where you're watching from, drop your theories on what Larry is hiding, and I will see you in the next one. Here's what Agatha didn't know, as she stood outside that hotel with Min-jae's hand in hers, feeling lighter than she had in years. 3 weeks before her flight to Seoul, Larry had sat in a private meeting with 2 men Agatha had never heard of. Men who specialized in exactly the kind of information Larry needed if he wanted to walk away from this divorce with something more valuable than money. Because losing Agatha hadn't just cost him a marriage. It had cost him his reputation among the exact circle of investors and clients who mattered most to him, men who now looked at him differently at every dinner, every golf outing, every boardroom, the man who got publicly humiliated by a Korean crime boss over his own wife. Larry wanted that reputation back. And in his mind, there was only one way to get it. He'd spent the last several months quietly building a file, photographs, documents, a financial trail he claimed connected the fashion house's sole partnership to funds he alleged were laundered through Min-jae's business interests. Some real, some fabricated, all of it packaged carefully enough to look convincing to the right journalist, the right federal investigator, the right person willing to make Agatha's new life implode in the most public way imaginable. It wasn't about winning Agatha back. Larry knew that ship had sailed the moment Min-jae's fist connected with his jaw in front of witnesses. This was about something colder, something that had been simmering under every humiliating comment he'd ever made about her age, her looks, her worth. This was about making sure that if he couldn't have the life he'd built, neither could she. He'd made one phone call the morning of Argatha's flight to Seoul. A reporter, a well-known one, the kind whose name alone could make a company's stock dip within hours of a story breaking. "I have something you're going to want to see," Larry said into the phone, watching out his office window as, 3,000 miles away and several hours ahead, his ex-wife stepped off a plane into the arms of the very story he was about to blow wide open. If you thought this ended with a kiss outside a hotel, think again, because Larry just lit a fuse that's about to go off in the middle of Argatha's new life, and neither she nor Min-jae have any idea it's coming. Back in Seoul, Argatha spent that first week back in a kind of quiet disbelief that her life could actually feel this good. She and Min-jae fell into an easy rhythm. Neither of them had to force. Dinners that lasted for hours, walks through Gangnam at night, where nobody dared approach them, quiet mornings, where he made terrible coffee on purpose, just to make her laugh at how bad it was. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Argatha wasn't managing anyone's moods but her own. She threw herself into the Asia-Pacific expansion, flying between Seoul and Tokyo and Hong Kong, closing deals with a confidence that surprised even the executives who'd worked with her for years. She started mentoring a young analyst on her team, a woman in her 20s who reminded Argatha so much of who she used to be before she let a marriage slowly erase her, that she found herself crying quietly in a hotel bathroom one night, grateful and grieving all at once for the years she'd lost. Min-jae, for his part, began doing something none of his men had ever seen him do. He started delegating. Not everything. The empire didn't run itself, and there were parts of his world Argatha never asked about, and he never offered to explain. But he cleared entire evenings for her. He learned her schedule, memorized the cities she'd be in each week, and more than once flew hours out of his way just to have dinner with her, before flying back before dawn for a meeting nobody could know he'd nearly missed. His men noticed. They didn't say anything, not directly, but there was a shift in how they looked at him, something like relief mixed with disbelief, as though watching their untouchable boss soften around one American woman was the strangest and most human thing they'd witnessed in years. But wait, because not everyone in Min-jae's world was happy about it. There was a man named Tae-sung, an older lieutenant who had served Min-jae's late father for decades before serving Min-jae himself, who watched the relationship develop with a wariness he didn't bother hiding. He approached Min-jae privately one evening, choosing his words with the careful respect of a man who knew exactly how far he could push before crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "She's American," Tae-sung said. "Divorced, older. People will talk. Enemies will look for weakness. And a woman outside our world is exactly the kind of weakness they look for." Min-jae didn't raise his voice. He rarely did. But something in his stillness made Tae-sung take half a step back. "Then they'll learn quickly that she isn't a weakness," Min-jae said. "She's the reason I remember why any of this is worth protecting." Tae-sung said nothing more. But the warning had been planted, and 3 days later, when the first email from a journalist landed in the fashion house's press office, asking pointed questions about the company's Seoul partnership and its ties to organized crime, Tae-sung would be the first person to realize exactly how right he'd been to worry. If you're invested in this story, comment where you're watching from, and hit subscribe, because what happens when that email reaches Argatha is going to change everything you thought you knew about how this ends. The email landed in the fashion house's press office at 6:47 in the morning Seoul time, and by 9 a.m., it had already been forwarded up 3 levels of leadership before it reached Argatha's inbox, with a single line from her CEO above the forward, "We need to talk." Now, Argatha read it standing in her hotel room, coffee going cold on the table behind her, and felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. The journalist's questions were specific, too specific. Financial records that referenced real transaction dates, names of Min-jae's holding companies that had never been made public, details about the partnership's funding structure that Argatha herself hadn't known, buried in documents that looked, at first glance, disturbingly legitimate. Someone had built this deliberately. Someone with access to information that should have been impossible to get without inside knowledge of both the fashion house's finances and Argatha's personal life. It took her exactly 4 minutes of staring at the email to understand who. Larry. The realization hit her like a second slap, worse than the first one had been, because this wasn't about hurting her anymore. This was about burning down everything she'd rebuilt, everything she'd earned back one painful month at a time, just to prove he still had the power to do it. She called Min Jae before she even finished processing her own fury. He picked up on the first ring, and something in her voice must have told him everything he needed to know before she said a single word. "Where are you?" he asked. Already moving, she could hear it in the sound of a door opening behind his voice. 20 minutes later, he was standing in her hotel room, reading the email over her shoulder in silence, his jaw tightening with every line. When he finished, he set her phone down on the table with a careful, deliberate calm that Argatha had learned, by now, was far more dangerous than shouting would have been. "He did this before you even landed," Min Jae said quietly. "He planned it around your flight." Argatha sat down hard on the edge of the bed, the adrenaline draining out of her all at once, leaving something colder and heavier behind. "I thought I was done being collateral damage in his need to control something," she said. Min Jae crouched in front of her, taking both her hands in his. "You are done," he said. "This isn't about him controlling you. This is about him trying to control the story. And I am very, very good at making sure people don't get to control stories about me. But wait, because this is where Argatha does something that surprises everyone, including Min Jae himself. She didn't ask him to make it disappear. She didn't ask him to use whatever frightening resources came with his world to quietly bury the journalist or intimidate Larry into silence, which she suspected, correctly, he would have done without hesitation if she'd simply nodded once. Instead, she stood up, wiped her face, and told him something that made his expression shift into an admiration he didn't bother hiding. "I want to handle this myself," she said. "I spent 22 years letting a man control my story. I'm not letting another one do it either, even if his intentions are good." Min Jae studied her for a long moment, and then, slowly, he nodded. "Tell me what you need." What Argatha needed was a lawyer, a forensic accountant, and 48 hours. She called her CEO, and, for the first time in her career, spoke to him not as a woman apologizing for a mess, but as an executive laying out a plan. She requested full access to the partnership's financial records, cross-referenced every document the journalist had cited against the company's actual books, and within 18 hours, her forensic accountant confirmed exactly what she suspected. Half the figures in Larry's leaked file had been fabricated, subtly altered from real documents he'd had access to, only because he was, technically, still listed as a beneficiary on several of Argatha's old financial accounts that the divorce hadn't fully unwound yet. It wasn't just a smear campaign, it was fraud, built on documents Larry had illegally accessed after their divorce was already finalized. Argatha's lawyer drafted a response to the journalist within the hour, laying out, point by point, exactly how the figures had been manipulated, and exactly who had manipulated them, with financial and legal evidence to back every claim. The journalist, to his credit, killed the story before it ever ran, unwilling to attach his name to information that could now be traced directly back to a source engaged in what was quickly starting to look like felony-level financial fraud. Crisis over. Story dead. Argatha's reputation, and the partnerships, fully intact. But Larry wasn't done. Because here's the part that's going to make you sit up straight in your seat. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button now. Because Larry's next move isn't going to be a phone call to a journalist. It's going to be something far more personal, and far more dangerous. And it's going to force Argatha and Min Jae to make a decision neither of them ever wanted to face. 2 nights later, a private investigator Larry had hired months earlier, the same men Argatha had briefly glimpsed in that boardroom photo but never thought twice about, finally delivered the report Larry had actually been waiting for all along. Not financial records, something worse, photographs, dates, locations, a detailed map of exactly where Argatha went, when, and who she went there with, compiled over 3 months of surveillance Larry had commissioned the very week their divorce was finalized. And buried in that surveillance file was something even Argatha didn't fully understand yet. Evidence that Min Jae's rival faction, a rising crime family from Busan that had been circling his territory for over a year, had been quietly watching the same photographs Larry's investigator had taken, waiting patiently for exactly the kind of opening a public scandal would hand them. Larry hadn't just tried to expose Argatha. He had accidentally handed Min Jae's enemies the exact information they needed to find her. If your jaw just dropped, comment part 2 right now, because you are going to want to see what happens when Min Jae finds out exactly who's been watching the woman he loves. Tae Sung was the one who found out first, which was exactly the kind of detail that would matter later, though nobody understood that yet. He'd kept a quiet watch on the Busan faction for over a year, the way a man does when he's buried enough friends to know that peace never lasts as long as anyone wants it to. When one of his contacts mentioned, almost in passing, that Busan had recently acquired a folder of surveillance photographs featuring an American woman connected to Kang Min Jae, Tae Sung didn't wait for confirmation. He drove straight to Min Jae's residence at 11 at night and let himself in without calling ahead, something he hadn't done in years. Min Jae was in the middle of showing Argatha how to properly hold chopsticks the way his grandmother had taught him, both of them laughing about how badly she was failing at it, when Tae Sung walked in, and the laughter died in the room before he said a single word. Argatha watched Min Jae's entire posture change as Tae Sung spoke in rapid Korean, low and urgent, and though she couldn't understand most of it, she understood the word Busan, and she understood the way Min Jae's hand found hers under the table and held on without either of them acknowledging it. When Tae Sung finished, the room was silent for a long moment. "What is it?" Argatha finally asked. "Tell me. I'm not a child who needs protecting from information about my own life." Min Jae looked at her for a long beat, weighing something, and then, for the first time since she'd known him, he told her everything. Not the sanitized version, not the version designed to keep her calm, but the truth. That the rival faction from Busan had spent over a year testing the edges of his territory, waiting for a moment of weakness. That Larry's surveillance photographs, meant only to humiliate her, had somehow made their way into Busan's hands, likely purchased from the same private investigator Larry hired, a man apparently willing to sell information to the highest bidder, regardless of the consequences. And that Busan now had a face, a routine, and a location to attach to the one thing capable of making Kang Min Jae vulnerable for the first time in his adult life. "You," Min Jae said quietly. "They have you." Argatha felt something cold settle in her stomach, but underneath the fear, something else was rising too, the same steadiness that had carried her out of Larry's kitchen for the last time, the same refusal to shrink that had gotten her through the last 7 months. "So what do we do?" she asked. And the "we" wasn't lost on either of them. But wait, because this is the part where Min Jae reveals something about himself that changes how you'll see this entire story. He told her, plainly, that his first instinct, his oldest instinct, the one bred into him since he was a teenager watching his father run this empire, was to disappear her somewhere safe and handle Busan the way his world had always handled threats, decisively, permanently, without her ever needing to know the details. It would have been easy. It would have been, by the standards of the life he'd inherited, entirely reasonable. "But I'm not going to do that," he said, "because the last man who tried to make decisions about your life without asking you is the reason we're in this mess in the first place." Argatha felt something in her chest crack open at that, something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the strange, overwhelming relief of being seen as a partner instead of a problem to be managed. So instead, they made the decision together. Argatha wasn't going into hiding. She wasn't going to let Busan or Larry or anyone else dictate the shape of her life ever again. Instead, Min Jae called a meeting, a real one, formal, the kind that hadn't happened between his family and Busan's in over a decade, and requested it not as a show of force but as an offer of terms. 3 days later, in a private room at a restaurant neither faction had ever used before, chosen deliberately as neutral ground, Min Jae sat across from Busan's aging patriarch and laid out exactly what he was willing to do to protect the woman sitting quietly beside him, and exactly what it would cost anyone who tried to touch her. Argatha had insisted on being in that room. Every instinct in Min Jae's world screamed against it, but she reminded him, quietly, before they walked in, that she had spent 22 years letting men make decisions in rooms she wasn't allowed into, and she was done with that particular kind of invisibility, in this life or any other. The patriarch studied her for a long moment across the table, something calculating in his gaze. Before he finally spoke, his voice measured and careful. "She's the reason you'd risk everything," he said. "It's true then. The rumors." Min-jae didn't hesitate. "Yes." "If you think that's the twist, hold on, because it isn't. Comment below where you're watching from, hit that subscribe button, because what the Busan patriarch says next is the moment that changes absolutely everything about how this story ends, and you do not want to miss part 2. The patriarch let the silence stretch, long enough that even Min-jae's men shifted almost imperceptibly by the door, long enough that Argatha's pulse climbed in her throat despite every effort to keep her face composed. Then the old man did something nobody in that room expected. He laughed, not a cruel laugh. Something closer to genuine amusement, the kind of laugh that comes from a man who has seen enough of the world to find its patterns funny, even when they're dangerous. He turned to one of his own men and said something quick in Korean, and Argatha watched the tension in the room shift, just slightly, though she still had no idea why. Min-jae's expression didn't relax. If anything, it sharpened. "What did he say?" Argatha asked quietly. Min-jae's jaw was tight. "He says he already knew." The patriarch spoke again, this time in English, deliberately, his gaze moving between Min-jae and Argatha, with something that looked almost like respect. "Your father," he said, nodding at Min-jae, "made the same mistake I did once. He built an empire, and forgot to build a life inside it. I watched him grow cold, grow alone, grow into a man his own men feared more than they respected. When I heard the rumors about the American woman, I assumed it was weakness. I sent people to look. What they found was not weakness." He turned his full attention to Argatha. "They found a man who laughs again," he said, "who eats dinner instead of skipping it for meetings, who sleeps instead of pacing his office at 3 in the morning. My men reported this to me not as an opportunity, as a warning that he had become something more dangerous than before, not less. A man with something worth protecting fights harder than a man with nothing left to lose." Argatha felt the air leave her lungs slowly. The fear she'd been carrying since Taesung burst into that apartment, finally beginning to loosen its grip. "So this was never an attack," Min-jae said slowly, understanding arriving before Argatha's did. "This was a test." The patriarch inclined his head. "Consider it a courtesy. One old family extends to a young one still finding its footing. The photographs will disappear. The men who sold them to us will be dealt with, quietly, in whatever manner satisfies your own sense of justice. Busan has no interest in a war with a boy who has finally found a reason not to burn his own empire down chasing one. But wait, because there's one more thing the patriarch says before he stands to leave, and it's the sentence that's going to stay with you long after this video ends." He looked directly at Argatha one final time, his expression softening into something almost grandfatherly. "Whatever man hurt you before this one," he said, "he did you a favor he will never understand. He made you the kind of woman who walks into a room full of men who could end her life with a phone call, and instead of trembling, she asks questions. That is not survival. That is power he was too small to recognize when he had it in his own house." Argatha didn't trust her voice enough to respond. She simply nodded, and the patriarch smiled, and the meeting that could have ended in bloodshed ended instead with an old man rising slowly from his seat, straightening his jacket, and walking out with nothing more than a warning, wrapped in something close to blessing. The moment the door closed behind him, Argatha finally let herself breathe. "That's it," she said. "That's really it." Min-jae pulled her into him, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, just stood there in a private room in the aftermath of a threat that had somehow, impossibly, resolved itself into something like peace. But some threats don't come from rival families. Some come from ex-husbands who don't know when to stop. Because 3 days later, back in New York for a final round of divorce paperwork Argatha thought had already been settled, Larry showed up at her office unannounced. The surveillance photographs he'd commissioned spread across a manila folder in his hand, no longer useful to him now that Busan had abandoned any interest in the scandal he'd hoped to sell. He was desperate now, and desperate men make careless decisions. "I know what you told them," he said, dropping the folder on her desk, his voice shaking with something that had curdled from arrogance into something far uglier. "I know about the fraud investigation. My lawyer says I could go to prison for what I did with those accounts." Argatha looked at the folder, then at him, and felt nothing but a strange, distant pity for the man she'd once believed was the only person who would ever want her. "Then you should have thought about that before you tried to destroy my life to save your ego," she said calmly. Larry's face twisted. "You think that Korean boy is going to protect you forever? You think this is real? He's a criminal, Argatha. You're a temporary distraction to a man like that, and when he's done, you'll have nothing left, not even the life you had with me." Argatha stood up slowly, and for the first time in the entire relationship, in the entire marriage, in the entire 22 years, she felt absolutely nothing when he tried to make her small. "Get out of my office, Larry," she said. "And if you ever show up here again, the fraud charges will be the least of your problems. Because next time, I won't be the one who decides how merciful this ends." Larry stared at her for a long moment, searching for the woman who used to shrink under exactly this kind of pressure, and finding nothing there but calm, unshakable resolve. He left without another word, but he wasn't finished. Because that night, checking his phone in the back of a cab, Larry received a single text message from an unknown Korean number, no name attached, only 6 words that made his blood run cold. "We know where you live now." If that just gave you chills, comment part 2 below right now, because Larry just made the one mistake nobody in his position should ever make. He threatened Argatha Artis in a city where Kang Min-jae has eyes on every street corner, and next time, there won't be a boardroom, a patriarch, or a warning wrapped in mercy waiting for him. Let me know where you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see exactly what happens to Larry next, and drop part 2 in the comments if you need to know how this ends. I'll see you in the next one. Argatha didn't find out about that text message until much later, and by then, everything had already changed. What she knew, in the days after Larry stormed out of her office, was simpler than the war brewing quietly in the background. She knew she'd stopped flinching when her phone buzzed with unknown numbers. She knew she'd stopped rehearsing apologies in her head before difficult conversations. She knew that somewhere in the last 7 months, without fully noticing it happen, she had become someone who no longer needed anyone's permission to take up space in her own life. She flew back to Seoul 2 days later, and Min-jae met her at the airport himself, something he almost never did, waving off the 2 men who usually handled that duty. He didn't mention Larry, he didn't mention Busan, or the patriarch, or any of the machinery still quietly turning behind the scenes to keep her safe. He simply took her bag, kissed her forehead, and asked her how her flight was, like she was any woman coming home to any man in any ordinary life. That, she was starting to understand, was the strange gift he kept giving her without ever announcing it. In a world built on power and fear and consequence, he had somehow built the one space in her life that felt entirely, blessedly normal. That night, on the balcony of his apartment overlooking the same skyline where they'd first spilled wine and traded quiet confessions, Argatha finally asked him the question she'd been carrying since the meeting with Busan. "What happens now?" she asked. "To all of it. To Larry. To the danger. To any of it." Min-jae was quiet for a long moment, watching the city lights instead of her face. "Now," he said finally, "we live. Whatever comes, we face it as it comes. I can't promise you a life without danger, Argatha. I never could. But I can promise you, it won't be a life where you disappear inside it." She reached for his hand, and for the first time since a stranger on a balcony told her she was standing in the one spot with decent lighting, Argatha Artis understood that she had finally found a life she didn't need to shrink herself to survive. But 3,000 miles away, in the back of a New York cab, Larry was staring at 6 words on his phone screen that told him his time was already running out, and whatever came next for him wasn't going to be gentle, wasn't going to be fair, and wasn't going to give him the chance to talk his way out of it the way he always had before. If you've made it this far, thank you for writing this one out with me. Comment part 2 below. If you want to see what happens to Larry, comment where you're watching from, if you haven't already, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss it when it drops. I'll see you in the next one.